Good evening, everyone out there in Zoom. We'll be getting started in just a moment. People here at the Book Club of California are just taking their seats right now. Thank you for joining us. We have a little over 120 people joining us on Zoom today, so we're going to give them a little time to enter from the waiting room as well. Yeah. Are we all ready here in the room to get started? We'll give it another few seconds for the folks on Zoom to enter from the waiting room and folks here in the book club to take their seats.
I'll be right back.
We have a slightly new viewing experience here with our Owl Pro camera that you see here up on the podium. If you're in the Zoom world, you'll let us know how it works. If it looks any better than maybe the last time you came to a live and streamed book club program. Are we good over there? Yep, great. Let's get started, everyone. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, here at the Book Club of California and in the Zoom universe. Welcome to the Book Club's live and online presentation by author, filmmaker, and board member of the Little Tokyo Historical Society, Jeffrey G. Chin. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to tonight's program. For those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, history, collecting, and much, much more. So if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, I strongly encourage you to talk to me after the program if you're here in person, or go to our website at bccbooks.org. Dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work we do without the support of our members. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. A Rebel's Outcry, Biography of Issei Civil Rights Leader Sei Fujii, 1882 to 1954. This again is a live, in-person, and online presentation by author, filmmaker, and board member of the Little Tokyo Historical Society, Jeffrey G. Chin. Filmmaker Jeffrey G. Chin is an MFA alumnus of University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts and honors graduate of University of California at Berkeley Film Studies. His works focus on sharing the untold stories of immigrant pioneers who have changed the fabric of the United States. His activism began in his youth when he documented the stories at China Camp State Park and Angel Island Immigration Station. He is currently supervising a television station in San Francisco while developing his future productions. Now, tonight, Jeffrey will be speaking about the book, A Rebel's Outcry, Biography of Issei Civil Rights Leader Sei Fujii, 1882 to 1954. It's an illustrated biography and detailed look into the life of Japanese-American civil rights leader Sei Fujii, known for overturning the California Alien Land Law in 1952 and founding the Japanese-American newspaper Kashu Mainichi, California Daily News. His complex history reveals his intriguing journey as an immigrant, a social justice activist, unionizer, and a community leader. Fujii's story exemplifies the multitude of ways Americans have and may continue to fight for our civil rights. Now, in terms of logistics, tonight's webinar will include a presentation by Jeffrey G. Chin and then a Q&A session. If you're joining us via Zoom and have questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A. We'll also try to take questions from you here in the in-person audience. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jeffrey G. Chin.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for all of you to attend this event. And I'm so thankful of all the audience members who are watching virtually. This is a great honor to be participating in a program with the Book Club of California, 110 years of history. So actually, when I first visited Kevin to see this site, I was just so taken by sort of the delicate thought and care, and the respect for publications. One of my thoughts was maybe I'll just do a talk only about the design of the book, but I kind of wanted to take you guys on an adventure and talk about how we sort of formulated how this book would come to being. First up, I would like to thank Cindy Abrams, who is also a board member of our Little Tokyo Historical Society. She was courteous enough to introduce us to the Book Club of California. And also thank you to all the descendants of the civil rights leaders who are actually listening in virtually. I think some of the grandchildren of some of the civil rights leaders we're talking about today. And also, of course, my family and friends and all of you. Thank you. There you go. So to start out, when we were doing some early research on this story about Sei Fujii, we didn't know much about him. We knew that he was an alumni of USC Law School. He had a newspaper. He was an immigrant from Japan. That's pretty much what we knew about him. In his involvements in the civil rights cases, he had won 2 major Supreme Court cases, one to help build a hospital in Boyle Heights, which was a US Supreme Court case, Jordan v. Tashiro in 1928. So that was in direct response to the 1918 flu epidemic, as hospitals were not serving Japanese. And so they wanted to have a place that could serve the community. And later, of course, to overturn the California Alien Land Law, which had prohibited the majority of Asian immigrants and other immigrant communities from owning land in California because they were not allowed to become citizens by law. And we also had the story of this other wonderful fellow, and I apologize, Alice. Alice is the granddaughter of J. Marion Wright. They're on virtually. But we always like to feature him in his cowboy outfit because that was always his dream and vision. The family had come from the East Coast. He came from an ancestry of English knights, but he was also very selfless and determined to help as many people as he could. And one of the best allyships he's made in his life was to work with the Japanese American community. So we have a story of J. Marion Wright, a USC Law alumnus, 1913, and the story of Sei Fujii, an alumnus of 1911. Descendant of English knights, descendant of samurai. And together, they work alongside each other for about 5 decades. And even J. Marion Wright continues to work beyond that time to fight for equal rights for the Japanese citizens or Japanese immigrants, as well as other minority groups. So this whole story started for me when I was actually doing documentaries for Angel Island. Angel Island, by the way, is sort of considered the Ellis Island of the West, opened from 1910 to 1940. And at that time, I'd been doing a bunch of documentaries and, I was getting ready to want to tell a narrative film. about an Asian American pioneer. And so I was introduced to this story about a fellow named Sei Fujii who helped build a hospital for his community. And I was like, I don't know where this will lead, but I'm curious to learn more. Also, the story about him being an attorney. And at that time, my parents wanted me to go to law school. And funny enough, I ended up making stories about attorneys. So here we are. This is sort of near Medford, Oregon. We have Janice Lamoury. This is the daughter of J. Marion Wright. She was around 93 or 94 then. That was about in 2010. And she would tell us stories about the relationship of her father working alongside Sei Fujii and the cases that they were involved in. We didn't know much then, and we were continually learning more about sort of this partnership, this unique allyship between the two of them. But she was so wonderful and warm that you could almost feel what her own father was like, the way that she would just be welcoming to us and invite us in and just share whatever story she could. In her archives, however, she had a book, and it was a biography that was written in Japanese, and it was called Rafu Ondo by a man by the name of Kenichi Sato. And that was sort of this sort of hidden Easter egg within her archive. In her collections, she had documents of all the early civil rights cases, even the times when the Japanese farmers were using arsenic to prevent insects from infesting the cabbage. And so, but this guy ended up leading us into a larger story about the law partner, Sei Fujii. So going back into it, we knew that Sei Fujii had run the Kashu Mainichi, the California Daily News, a newspaper for his community. He had founded and helped support getting the Japanese hospital built in 1929. At that time, they raised over $100,000 in the middle of the Depression to build that hospital. It was a fantastic case where basically it was illegal for Japanese to own land, but it wasn't illegal for corporations to own land. So Japanese doctors, as well as Sei Fujii and J. Marion Wright, they had traveled all the way to Washington, D.C., and they proved that under the gentleman's agreement, that under the terms of commerce, that they could have medical facilities under the corporation. So, and of course, we heard about the alien land law case, but beyond that, we started hearing these small little stories about assassination attempts of our civil rights leader. And so we continued digging deeper. Here we had this wonderful anecdote, as I mentioned, of Sei Fujii traveling all the way to Washington, D.C., and this is him meeting one of the head chefs in the rail car, and he was sharing a rice ball with the chef, and he was making friends with everyone along the way. And he nicknamed his sort of diplomacy, the rice ball diplomacy, as he was making friends and sort of sharing the food that he would eat. And the little girl is actually supposed to be Janice, J. Marion Wright's daughter, watching, so she had traveled along the way. We also heard stories about big raids of liquor and gambling in Little Tokyo. And in fact, I was speaking to the grandson of the owner. This was the Erufune Cafe, and how there used to be a lot of raids on the community in the 1920s and 30s when there was barring of gambling or liquor sales. And then also going back to the story of this one reporter who was trying to find out where all of this could connect back to. And so let's teleport ourselves into the 1980s. Sei Fujii had been long gone. It had been about 3 decades. And this Japanese reporter comes over from Japan. He's commissioned by the newspaper, and he wants to find this alien land property. And so here's a sort of rendition of the time that he came all the way to Los Angeles in search of the property, and how we too actually ended up doing the same thing as we were exploring this journey. And this is the Rafu Ondo, the official biography that was commissioned during that time. And it was researched for about 10 years. And what happened was that it sort of just got lost in the collections, in the museums, and of course Janice Lamoury's home. And it was sort of long forgotten, sort of like the stories of these civil rights leaders. But we didn't know he was still alive. So we had the opportunity to track him down. We had someone introduce us through there's a newspaper called The Cultural News, who had worked with Kenichi Sato back in the 80s, and said, I have his address. So we ended up traveling all the way to Japan. I think it was in 2011. And we went to a small town called Sakata in Yamagata Prefecture, which is a little northeast of Tokyo. And so I met this older gentleman. He had a nice British accent, because that's where he learned his English. And he'd just be sitting in his room smoking a pipe. He was very stoic, because I don't think he had an opportunity in the recent years to interact with Americans, especially people who were curious about the history that he had spent so long researching. But he began telling us more and more stories, and we opened him up with bottles of sake. We went to the local izakaya, so the equivalent of tapas, and he wanted to have us order this wonderful bottle of sake with him. And he said, I don't remember the full Japanese name for it, but basically he said, it's called He Who Charms Women. And we said, why did you choose that one? He's like, it reminds me of Sei Fujii. And I said, why specifically? He's like, well, Sei Fujii was notorious for running away with married women. So, so this, we drink to him. And so we started getting along quite well. And by the end of the trip, he gave us the blessing to translate the book to English. And then he also gave us his entire collection. So we could, instead of just taking the story that was once told to the Japanese audience overseas, that we could finally bring that story back to the United States. So smaller anecdotes that we discovered going through the book. We discovered that Sei Fujii used to have these little pamphlets that he would pass out to the Japanese farmers. It was illegal, right, for Japanese to own land, Japanese immigrants, but it was not illegal for their children as American citizens to own land. So he used to sort of distribute these small pamphlets, but at that same time, it spoke about the Keep California White campaign, which was very discriminatory, sort of a legacy of the Chinese exclusion cases that was sort of established by our late mayor and then senator. So, and also we discovered these other immigration suits. So we didn't know this, but Japanese were actually immigrating quite a bit over the Mexican border in the 1920s and 30s. And you never really think about Asian immigrants coming over the Mexican border. And so what was happening was that due to the exclusion laws, it was easier for them to go down through Mazatlan and make their way up into El Centro. And what happened when they arrived, of course, was they would get guided all the way through. They would have to hide under alfalfa haystacks. There was, would it be crocodiles or alligators or one of those two reptiles ready to eat them. And by the time they got into town, someone was ready to turn them in. And basically the immigration officers during that time were making a lot of money by capturing these immigrants, and they were holding rents. Basically there's $500 a head. If you wanted to release your family member who just jumped over the border, you'd have to pay $500. But along with that, they discovered that it wasn't just the immigration officers who were involved. There was also Japanese businessmen who were making money off of it as well. So Sei Fujii did not like that at all. In fact, he called a meeting with 1,000 of these Japanese farmers. And they had this big town hall meeting at this place called Yamato Hall. And he was discussing with them about just to be aware of what's going on with immigration. Lo and behold, guess who came knocking? Walter Bliss, the immigration officer. And so instead of telling everyone in the room to scatter, he tells them, calm down, and he invites Mr. Bliss to come up to the front of the room. He says, don't worry, I'll translate for you. Well, he didn't exactly translate her, and he more so interpreted for him. And while Bliss was up front trying to command his audience and tell them, you know, you're going to be arrested and you have to follow the laws. Sei Fujii was telling everyone that basically, this is the man who comes at night. He's going to ask for ransom money. He's going to, you know, he's been pocketing and padding their wallets. And what happened was the farmers got so enraged that they started attacking him, and the guy nearly died. So it became a huge lawsuit. And it also led to several incidents where there was assassination attempts on our civil rights leader. So. But, you know, Sei Fujii used his platform because, right, as an attorney, he was not allowed to practice law. He didn't have his law license. He had to work with J. Marion Wright to go to court and represent. So he used a newspaper, and, you know, in order to communicate to his community, and he also had a radio program. And so he would always do these programs to uplift the next generation. He would talk about how people are doing in schools and how people are getting to celebrate what the community has been doing. And this is all the years leading up to World War II. And so it was different because he wanted the second generation to feel very proud as Americans, and as the first generation immigrants, it's very difficult for them to be accepted because they don't get the same rights as everyone else. Also in our research, we found very interesting stories, and I don't know if you guys are mostly Berkeley crowd or UCLA crowd, but there's a huge connection of the USC as USC. We had Owen Kupfer, we had Everett Mattoon, Sei Fujii, and J. Marion Wright. And most of these guys, the three Caucasian guys, they were mostly Shriners, so they belonged to the Freemason and secret societies. And then Sei Fujii also had belonged to the Japanese American groups. And all four of them worked together in fighting to win these cases. In fact, Everett Mattoon, the second guy from the left, was on the opposing counsel for the alien land law case. But I think they used that to their advantage because they were all classmates together to strategize how they're going to elevate and bring it to court. So in our research, we were able to go back to Japan. I visited Sei Fujii's ancestral home. This is the sort of older family tree that goes back, I think, like 150, 200 years. We met with Sei Fujii's granddaughter, and this is his ancestral home. And I also went to Yamaguchi University, where I found an old yearbook that had documents of how he ended up dropping out of high school, actually failing out because he didn't want to abide by what his grandfather wanted of him. So if you guys remember, sort of late 1800s, Japan was going through that new evolution with westernization. There's the Meiji Restoration, and Japanese were being encouraged to study overseas. And with that, many people in Western Japan, they would get educated and they would oftentimes become politicians. So Sei Fujii's grandfather said, I want you to study, and then you're gonna become a politician. Sei Fujii decided instead, I'm gonna fail out of high school and transfer to America. So he ended up attending Compton Union High School, working as a houseboy for the Ralph's Market family, and then eventually attending USC. So I started hiding the lead in all this because I didn't want to focus on all the accolades that we've been able to do with this research. But during the portions of the research, one of the first steps we did was we made a short film. It starred Academy Award winner Chris Tashima, and we wanted to tell the story in 1935 during one of the most challenging times for a civil rights leader, which is to confront your own community. And this is when gambling dens were taking advantage of farmers coming into town, and oftentimes they would try to burn down his newspaper or try to kill him. And so this film did pretty well. We were able to share it with the US Embassy. It won a bunch of awards. But one of the best blessings with this was that we were able to extend the way that we've been able to share his story. We built a memorial lantern in Little Tokyo, designed after the type of lanterns that you would have seen in Iwakuni and his ancestral home. That's Miles Endo, son of a famous taiko player, Kenny Endo. And we designed it as a lantern because we wanted to create it as a beacon for future civil rights leaders, community members to look up to sort of extend that allyship and protection for communities. We were also able to right the wrong of Sei Fujii not being able to have his law license. So Sei Fujii is actually the first Japanese American to have a posthumous law license in California, and that was brought to the California Supreme Court. We also got historic designation of the Japanese hospital, which means that it will be the building will be protected historically and preserved. And that was led by our board members of the Historical Society, Kristen Hayashi and Michael Kimura. And one thing that's been special this week is that, or this past week, was that it's the 70th anniversary of the overturn of the California Alien Land Law. And so we were able to honor Sei Fujii by bringing flowers to his grave and also having a special program at USC to commemorate that history. I'm still constantly learning more about the history as we've gone through this. I was mentioning to some of the audience members that Sei Fujii also partnered with a prominent Black attorney leading up to World War II. The attorney's name was Hugh Macbeth, and together they did a whole race relations campaign for 6 years, trying to unite the community as all the tensions were raising. So more so going back to this idea of what the California Book Club is about, I wanted to show you guys a little bit of the design of the book. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just text and something that you would just put into the shelf and not have an opportunity to really, get into. I wanted to make it a conversational piece for people. And so sort of like the New Yorker, there's small images that represent what's going on. And then inspired by Miyazaki, this famous Japanese filmmaker known for his animation films, I wanted to create a tableau image that would represent what's going to go on through the chapters. Sei Fujii was also very controversial, as I mentioned. One of his biggest controversies was that he told his community that Japan and the United States would definitively not go to war right before World War II. And the reason he chose to say that was because if his community started converting all the US dollars to yen and started to leave, they would have lost everything they had worked so hard over the many decades to build up for the community. For those in the audience on the web who aren't able to see the book physically, we did specifically Japanese stab binding along the sides. And if you look closely at the book, you can see Sei Fujii's name in kanji. And even closer over his right shoulder, it's his fingerprints from the Japanese incarceration camps. And all these images were recolored for the purpose to bring to life this world and life that Sei Fujii had lived. So yeah, I would like to open it up to questions and have an intimate discussion with you guys. We have a bunch of goodies, by the way, for those interested in the book. J. Marion Wright's granddaughter has graciously donated a copy of the J. Marion Wright biography that will come complimentary with the book, as well as a journal from Japan to us.
Great, so we should take questions from the audience. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to make? Sure.
Often in interracial organizing in the 1930s, there would be a heavy influence from the Communist Party. And I know the Communist Party in California had well over 100 Japanese American members. Pre-internment camps, they lost them all with the internment camps due to a very bad position the communists had. But what relationship did he have with the communists? Because I assume within there, since he was doing some interracial organizing, there is some relationship probably.
I do know that when they did race relations campaigns, they definitely met up with Chicano, Chinese, Jewish, Black representatives. So I'm sure he encountered them. One of the more controversial things he was dealing with was that he was actually helping initially raise some funds for the Japanese warplanes. And a lot of his colleagues told him to stop doing that. And what happened is the moment he stopped doing that, he kind of got blacklisted by Imperial Japan. So, because he was calling a lot of attention, but I think for him, my mindset is that he just wanted to see his mother country succeed because it wasn't even involving the United States at that time.
Other questions? Yes, right there, next.
I'm a legal and constitutional scholar, and so I'd like to know a little bit more about the Alien Land Act case.
So the Alien Land Law, I believe, was established in 1913. It was a method to sort of restrict land ownership. And of course, land ownership for communities means a lot. Whether it's Asian, Latino, or Black, it means that you're not able to really root yourself. And so the Alien Land Law was something that Sei Fujii had challenged throughout his career. Even the hospital case, they were trying to confront the Alien Land Law. I think it was like 1948 when he came out of camp, he decided that he was going to pursue buying a piece of land illegally. There's a famous case called the Oyama v. California that had recently been won, and it was a Japanese American son that was represented in the case, and they allowed the family to keep the land. But Sei Fujii was still not a citizen, and he wanted to be the plaintiff in the case as a non-citizen in order to prove that non-citizens should also have the right to own the land. So basically the property he bought, it was an illegal move, and they had to very much strategize how they were going to bring it up to the higher courts. And so it helped that some of his classmates were on the opposing counsel. You could read in the book. Yeah.
Question about the internment. Where was he through that, and was he able to use his legal background to influence anything?
So they picked him up right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He was having high blood pressure during that time, and he got pretty sick. He was out in Santa Fe Detention Center for the majority of his time, and that's where a lot of the community leaders and the other people who ran periodicals. The funny anecdote or interesting anecdote about that was that a lot of the people who ran the periodicals who were involved with the immigration smuggling ring, the ones who were profiting off, turning in their own people, they ended up in camp together. And so I think it was several different newspapers that they ended up pooling together to start one newspaper in camp to start writing together. In terms of dealing with the legal issues, so J. Marion Wright, and also, as I mentioned, Hugh Macbeth, they were trying to help defend the Japanese who were no longer able to protect their land because they're incarcerated. And so the California, there's a term called SG, where it's basically trying to prove that you are breaking the law by you're trying to bypass the law in ways that's immoral by trying to say, oh, you're going to give it to your son when they turn 18, or you bought it with a white family with the designation that it's going to be gifted to that 18-year-old Japanese American child. And so there's a lot of cases that J. Marion Wright and Hugh Macbeth had to represent to try to defend that land ownership for them. And also the Catholic Church was very involved with trying to help protect the older Japanese immigrants. So there's in our book documentation that by this Father Lavery from Maryknoll Church would write these extensive letters to say, you should help release these elderly Japanese because they're not going to survive through this. And it's a very sad situation because a lot of the Issei first generation ended up, having health issues after camp and during camp, and also maybe fell ill from alcoholism. And so it's like a pretty sad story, but Sei Fujii at least had enough fight in him after being released that he could overturn the Alien Land Law. He also refused to shave, so you'll see some interesting beard shots with him.
There's a question from Zoom asking, how did the Japanese farmers in California function during the alien land law?
So sometimes you could lease the land, and sometimes there was generous farmers willing to allow the Japanese to farm on the land. There was a lack of proper unions during that time, and so in the book it talks about how there's Sei Fujii helped form one of the first labor unions in San Diego, and he basically met up with a white landowner named Stafford, who was very much against immigrants, profiteering off farming. But Sei Fujii sent down 2 delegates to talk with him and said, we're just trying to survive here and just take a look at how hard we're working and what we can contribute. And that actually led to a good friendship with Stafford and leading into labor unions with the Chicanos, Filipinos, Chinese, and Japanese who were down there, and of course Caucasian as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the illustrations and the photos that you showed us that are in the book and how you got access to them?
Yeah, so this book is basically, from my end, about 10 years of research, but prior to me, years of research by Kenichi Sato, because we had to get that translated. We had it translated by a woman named Saiko Higa Dickinson and edited by Naomi Hirahara. She's one of the prominent Japanese American writers. But basically, a lot of the older photos, like this one, this was at his ancestral home. And we also were able to get some photos from the Japanese American National Museum. I had to go through microfilm, not microfiche. Someone corrected me on that. But we went through microfilm at UCLA. Funny thing, back to UCLA. UCLA helped us a lot on this book, even though it's not a USC guy. They gave us the major grants actually to make this. And also the newspaper scans came from UCLA's archives. And so we were able to take those scans and incorporate them in the book. For a lot of the history, for example, those anecdotes that we wouldn't be able to represent without having physical evidence, that's why we had drawings that would represent that history. Yeah.
Other questions? Let's do Eric first and then we'll come over here.
The binding is fascinating. Can you say a little bit more on how that binding connects with traditional Japanese culture and how you were able to reproduce that today?
Yeah, so one thing that I wanted for the book was I wanted it to feel special, like a family album that you can sort of have a discussion. If you leave it on your coffee table, someone can flip through it, revisit it, and explore it. And one of the binding options was the stab binding. It's called Japanese stab binding. And I thought, let's do something decorative that way, that when people see the book, that it would feel special in their hands. And then even the front cover, that was originally black and white, and it took a few iterations before we were able to even lock in like how to recolor it properly. I don't know if the camera still sees me, but even on the back of the book, we don't know if his tie was necessarily yellow or if he was wearing a blue suit, but emotionally it felt right. But all these legal books, I looked them up and I actually colored them exactly for what they would be. And so I wanted to just find a way to make it feel like it's coming to life. And as I mentioned, the kanji in his name, that was on the documents of his incarceration. And so I wanted to also to have his fingerprints on it. And hopefully we'll have your fingerprints on it too.
Over here.
Yeah, speaking of fingerprints and bringing to life, I mean, this is almost like a teaser for a movie, because we're getting to see Sei Fujii, in the little parts of it, but it is a human experience that you can see through leadership and taking a chance, and even for the young people or the older people, stand up for the rights, civil rights. It's so universal. I think that are there any plans to create a full feature film? Because I've just got that little bug of all these little things. I just can't wait to see and touch of the life and the style that exists there that transforms even a message today. It's just amazing.
Thank you very much for the question.
I don't know if it was a question.
Yeah.
but just some
It's a what's next? What's going to
Yeah, what's
happen
next?
question.
Thank you, Dad.
Oh, spoiler.
So
I'm proud of it.
I've been developing a feature film for a while now. I was lucky enough when I attended USCA, I was mentored by the late John Singleton, who did Boys in the Hood, Too Fast, Too Furious. And I'd always been talking to him about the stories, and he was just like always fascinated about the interconnectivity about communities. And so that's what I am planning to do, because you have the story of a Japanese American civil rights leader and the allyship of J. Marion Wright working with him, as well as a Black attorney, Hugh Macbeth, and their journey from the time of the immigration smuggling rings to the years leading up to World War II. It's a really colorful and fun era. And yeah, it's something that I've been very passionate about developing, and also conducting this research has helped me get the nuance of what was going on in this world, because I think, you know, you can never do enough research, but eventually you'll have to put it together somehow. So we have a book right now.
Was there anything that like didn't make the book that you wish did, an interview that you wanted to get?
We have a lot of really great like personal history, oral history interviews, and the majority of this text is from what Kenichi Sato had put together, even though we have the end chapters with myself and my co-author Fumiko Carol Fujita. But yeah, we have stories of more assassination attempts. We have stories about the times when he was educated, he was young, he was single, and he's good looking. And so we all heard stories about how married women would always come try to visit him when he was working at a restaurant, and they would just go flirt with him. So those sort of nuanced small stories are really fun. But right now I'm learning more, and I'm most fascinated about his relationship and connection with Hugh Macbeth. I think that is something very fascinating. Even in when he was in camp, there was letters from both Hugh Macbeth and his sister, who were involved with the race relations campaigns. And I just want to see more of that, because like when we think about civil rights, people immediately think color, and then it feels exclusive to those who don't get it, feel like they're part of it. But the thing is, in some ways, having that conversation and feeling that we all can contribute no matter what status that we have, I think is something I'd like to explore more.
How did you get to go to USC? And also, did you come across the National Lawyers Guild?
I didn't come across the National Lawyers Guild, but his USC story is very interesting. So as I mentioned, Meiji Restoration he comes from a lineage of these students that would study overseas. So at the very head of it is Mori Aranori, who was one of the, he developed the education system in modern Japan. And he studied overseas, I think in Europe in like 1860s. The next generation was this guy named Baron Conde, who had studied over on the East Coast. And then he had told Sei Fujii, you must come to America and study, but he also wanted him to come back to Japan and take his knowledge and bring it back. But Sei Fujii, instead, he did go back to Japan with one of his wives, and then he came back to America by himself. So. But you know, the family is very gracious for what he was able to do in America there. But anyway, attending USC, there is a small population of Japanese who were able to attend law school there. I think USC was much more progressive than some schools. Even for Hugh Macbeth, I think he went to Harvard. He had convinced the dean to let him in to Harvard. I think he was the first Black attorney to attend law school there. And so at that era, it was a lot of firsts for a different community of people.
Back to the illustrations, or were those watercolors that were used for the, and are those yours?
So my classmate Takashi Uchida did that. So he worked on animation when he was in Japan. Maybe I can show you a shot of it. And So a lot of it just started as a pencil sketch, and then we scanned it, and then he brought it into Photoshop. So it's actually digital watercolor. But surprisingly, it looks like it was painted with a watercolor brush. Yeah, he worked really hard on that. I was pretty tough on him. Sorry, Takashi. But you know, I think at the end of the day, we've all been very proud of the product that came from it. And the layouts were done by this woman named Amy Inoue. And also some of like stylistic parts, it helped that I had studied yearbook in high school. So it all came together this way. Yeah.
Other questions here in the room? Thanks for that question about USC, because that was a question out on Zoom as well. How did that happen? How did he get to go to USC? What kind of discrimination or challenges did he have there? So,
oh, interesting point though. So when you went to USC Law School, then you would immediately get your bar license. But since he was not a citizen, he wasn't allowed to. So he didn't even have to take, maybe they took some sort of test, but it was pretty much guaranteed when you attended back then. So.
Different now.
Yeah.
There is a question here from Zoom. The question is, or the statement is, I wonder if Sei Fujii worked with or knew civil rights attorney Wayne Collins, who devoted much of his career to helping Japanese American community after the war.
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
I could probably
check the index.
Yeah.
Check the index. Let's see what's
Wayne Collins.
Wayne Collins.
Yeah. Let's see. Not here, but I think if we did like have to abbreviate some points of the translation, and I'm sure that interaction, because like even when you look up any historical figure, you'll find someone who's immediately affiliated with them, and so it's like a rabbit hole. So, but I'm sure you interacted on some level.
Other questions here? Any other questions in the room? So there is a question: did Sei Fujii become an American citizen?
Yeah, so he lived in the United States for 51 years, and he was a citizen for only 51 days. That's because he sacrificed becoming a citizen until he would win the alien land law case. And then, so 1952, he overturned it, and then it took some time to process, and then 1954, December, he passed away.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a question from Zoom about if they weren't here tonight and they wanted to buy the book, how do they do that? And I can tell them that it's going to be sent out in the email that goes to everybody who signed up for Zoom. There is a link in there and information about how to buy the book, and actually information about how to contact Jeffrey if you have more questions or comments for him.
And you can scan the QR code on your Zoom and it will take you to an ordering page. So.
Yeah, try that. See if that works. Try to scan your screen to buy the book. Any other questions? I'm going to check. Oh, let's see. My father-in-law was interned in Santa Fe. His last name was Fujii, sometimes spelled F-U-J-I-I-E.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, perhaps they knew one another. I can send you some of these comments, and you can.
There's a really great archive at the Japanese American National Museum. The crazy part is that most of the names aren't, they didn't label everyone in the group photos, but you can find at least the list of the people, and you could probably see like which groups or which where they must have been living when they were incarcerated.
We want to make sure everyone has time to kind of look at the book and the other items that Jeffrey has brought along with him. So we're going to wrap up right now, unless there are any other questions. So you can do that. Yes, Gloria. You're always ahead of me. You're always one step ahead of me, Gloria. So when you came in, we told folks we were going to do a drawing for 5 copies of the short film. And if you have your tickets with you now, you can pull them out. I'm going to read the last 3 numbers. Otherwise, it's a really long number. And I'm only going to tell you the last 3. So if your ticket 318, 321, 323, 331, or 352. Oh, glory. So if you're one of those, I have the list here. And see me at the end, come up here right after we're done and we'll hook you up with your copy of the short film.
So I want to give you guys a quick anecdote. So you mentioned that there's certain things that I didn't get to incorporate in the book. So we were able to show the film to Sei Fujii's granddaughter in Iwakuni, and it had been exactly 100 years since he had left. And what happened was that late at night, yeah,
He's telling the story.
so late at night, she heard a knock at the door of the home, and she opened it, and no one was there. And then the next evening, she woke up and she saw him. So in some ways, she like his ghost, and so in some ways she felt that his spirit had finally returned. And when I went back, I saw butterflies flying around and following us as we were going up to the house, white butterflies. And so there's sort of this magical connection to all of this as well that, you know, it's hard to describe, but it exists. Oh, and then there's more interesting stories about his warlord ancestor who had run a big castle in Okayama, and they got exiled to the ancestral home, and all those other stories, which I have in a graphic novel that I plan to release.
More content is coming soon, is what Jeffrey's saying. Short film, major feature film, graphic novel, and maybe some more presentations or another book. So again, thanks to our speaker. Thank you, Jeffrey, for doing this, and thank you all. Thank you for everyone here in the room and everyone on Zoom for attending this Book Club of California program. It's great to have you here in person and out there in the virtual world. Our next program is an online talk, online only, not in person, on Monday, May 9th. It's titled 12 Things to Know, Collectors Reflect. And it's going to be a presentation by Spencer Stewart. He's a collections advisor, writer, and a lecturer. And it's a program in our series for new or beginning collectors, but the content is relevant to all kinds of book lovers. So if you're a book lover, you might want to join in for that. Again, it's titled 12 Things to Know, Collectors Reflect. You can register for that event online using the emails that you're getting from the Book Club of California, our kind of weekly programs emails. We'll have a link in there to register for it. Or you can go to bccbooks.org/programs to register. So again, thanks everyone for being with us tonight. We look forward to seeing you at another in-person program or having you join us online for another Zoom event. Thank you.
Get a photo with you.
Sure. Let's end this.
The 318, right?
Yeah.
318 is lucky winner.